we're going to double act this. We don't usually do lectures. We're landscape designers, so this is quite an unusual territory for us. So bear with us if you can. So we are going to double act. We've both worked on this project for an incredibly long time now, and both of us have a lot of detail that we want to get across. We've got a very visual slideshow, something like 85 slides in this, something like that. Yeah. There's a lot to get through. So I'm Kevin Redhead. I'm a director and landscape architect. I've been at Planet for 25 years. I'm joined by Matt Sturton, who's principal landscape architect. When we joined this project, I was the principal landscape architect. I've had a promotion. Matt's had a promotion to principal. So I was doing Matt's job when we started the project. Now Matt, I'm doing a better job. He's doing a better job. Thank you. The door's over there. So we're Planet. We are based in Altrincham. We've got other studios in the UK. But we are a very sort of Manchester-centric studio of designers. We do a lot of work in the city and a lot of work in the region. We particularly love working on heritage projects. There's 3 or 4 there that we've cited. Lincoln Square with the Lincoln Memorial next to St Mary's Church. Brunswick Park, if you know that, up by University of Manchester, that was a former road that we closed and turned into a really wonderful park for students. At the medieval quarter, we worked with the people who designed the arena bombing memorial. So we sort of set the space around that and done a lot of work around the medieval quarter. We've just recently opened All Saints Park up at MMU. And many more. Blackburn Cathedral, another project of ours. We don't just do heritage; we do parks. We do spaces, all different scales of spaces and different sectors. We work in sports and all sorts of stuff. So I think we're a pretty well qualified team of designers. We were hugely honoured to be invited to join the Town Hall project and come up with the designs for Albert Square and be part of our Town Hall story, particularly. We're both Manchester residents for decades. My children are born here, your children are born here. And we know the square. It's the heart of the city. It's a square that's close to our hearts. And we jumped at the chance of being part of its kind of next story. I just had a really interesting conversation with this lady over here about what that sort of square means, and for us it is a place where you go to celebrate, you go to mourn, you go to see concerts. It's the foremost event space in the city, and it's the thing where places happened. And we just had a conversation around the Burley tree. If anybody remembers the story of the Burley tree that was cut down up in Hume. And I was sat in Albert Square when that tree was bought by the local residents of Hume and brought into Albert Square and dumped on the steps of the council. The council of my client. I should be really careful about what I say here, but they're the kind of things that happen in Albert Square, a real sort of democratic space. And like I said, we're hugely proud to be part of it. This plan shows you just. For people who aren't residents of Manchester, or don't know Albert Square, that's where it sits in the heart of the city. It's right in the core of the civic quarter, and it's hugely significant space in the city. This is a conservation area plan for the civic quarter. You can see there Albert Square, but you can see where that row there where it says A, B, C, D, and E and F, they're all the statues that run through the square. Number 1, the Town Hall, and surrounded by really, really important listed buildings in the city centre, and so it has a real sort of importance when it comes to heritage. So Albert Square past. Anyone recognise this? This image, I think it's still in the City Gallery, isn't it?
Yeah.
More to come on that. So this is. I'm going to let Matt talk about the past now. I'm going to step aside a little bit.
Yeah. So I think we wanted to, bit of a Dickens cheesy reference and kind of, past, present, and future, and look at the kind of square in those kind of timescales, really. And it also, when we first started on the project, we did, kind of a massive amount of research and work looking into the past and the history of the square, and understand, how it developed to be the square that it was in 2017 when we started the project. And there's this great image by Villette, which I think a lot of people know. These really sort of atmospheric, kind of romantic paintings of Manchester. And we'll come back. There's a sort of more recent version of this that was done in 2015, but we'll revisit this image later on in the presentation. So yeah, the kind of start of the kind of point that we looked at was the square was actually kind of cleared for the Albert Memorial. So that square didn't exist for the town hall. They weren't kind of designed and kind of conceived together. It was actually in 1861, after Albert died, that a space was cleared in the city to create that kind of setting for a new memorial. So again, I can't point here, and I should probably put a red line around the square, but essentially, what is now the square was a lot of kind of old houses and industrial buildings, and the kind of, I don't know if you can sort of see the triangular shape in the centre of the image on the left, was the town's yard. So it was a whole kind of cluster of different buildings and workshops, and the square was cleared in I think it was kind of 1862 to 64. And then the Albert Memorial was installed, and actually came before the town hall building was built. So that was, I think, 1867 was when the memorial was completed, and 10 years later, the Manchester Town Hall was completed in 1877, designed by Alfred Waterhouse, and got a couple of images there of the design drawings, and it's great, just even kind of in the last sort of few weeks, looking back through these images we've not looked at for a while, but there's so many images on the Manchester archive that are just sort of so kind of full of kind of amazing kind of history and that story of the square.
I imagine this one's 1867.
So this might not be quite, yeah. I don't know if they kind of were that quick in constructing things, but this is just as the building was being completed, and you can see the Albert Memorial on the left of the screen there. So this was kind of 1877 when the square was first opened and the building first opened. It was a very kind of simple space, the monument in the centre, and really, I mean, you can already sort of see that there was kind of a bit of a circulation route around the edges. You can see some horse and cart in there, but yeah, I think the kind of key thing was at that point, the building had this fantastic setting, and over time, this is sort of developed, as we'll see. So 1901, at this point, over the kind of quarter of a century from when the building completed to this point, a series of monuments were installed through the square, and the fountain that you can see. Again, this is, a fantastic image that sort of captures all of that kind of activity at the turn of the century. And again, you can kind of see there that already there's this sense of vehicles and kind of circulation around this central space.
And busyness, really, isn't it?
Yeah,
it just has to be a really sort of functional space.
And it being a, kind of real hub of activity, as Kev says. So this was, kind of around 1901. There's that central space, and we think that the reason the monuments were kind of installed in that sequence was because that, kind of circulation and the movement around the kind of monument had already been established. And so those monuments were then delivered within that sort of central zone. And it was from kind of north to south that they were installed. So starting with Bishop Fraser, which is at the kind of top on the Princess Street edge as it is today, facing towards the cathedral, now facing the Metrolink, which is, interesting development. And then following that, a series of monuments, and the one at the bottom, probably most famously was William Gladstone, the former Prime Minister. And there was also Oliver Hayward and John Bright. So I think Hayward was a banker and philanthropist, and John Bright was a politician and statesman. So these people are obviously, kind of important at that time. but it's something that, again, the sort of stories that we wanted to kind of tell that are kind of modern day stories, which we'll kind of come on to later.
And of course, you got the fountain there that was put in as almost like a celebration of that sort of clean water connection to the lake district.
So this is, again, just there's so many images to go through. So we just tried to kind of, I think, capture that story from the kind of, I suppose, after the monuments were installed through to, the 60s and 70s. And I think what's interesting, you've got the tramway on that image on the left. And then as you kind of move across, you've got tanks in the square during the Second World War. And then finally, by the 50s and 60s, the motor vehicle has started to kind of, take root in the square. But that image, the 1964 image, it's always, even when, the kind of the road was established and vehicles kind of started to actually be able to park in the space, it was still a major event space, and lots of celebrations and activities would happen in the square. And this, again, I think is a great image. You can sort of see that those monuments that define that central space, but by the 60s, essentially was a sort of giant traffic island with, sort of multiple lanes of traffic all the way around the space. And then another interesting point actually was that there was public toilets which kind of were still kind of in the space until quite recently. But I think by the 50s, the first trees were planted, and they were planted again because of that, kind of vehicular circulation. The trees were planted along that kind of central lozenge. So everything was kind of confined to that kind of central area. And actually the trees that are still in the square today, some of them are trees that were planted in around 1950 or just after. And then coming on to kind of more recently, the 1980s, and at this point, the city council and the council landscape architect designed a new square, which was, a massive kind of move was to remove the road in front of the building and create that connection. So, starting to provide that proper setting to the building again and re-establish that open space and a space for people to use, and really to be able to kind of walk up to the front door of the building. And I suppose in that period from the 80s, the square is developed into that event space that everybody knows it was today, up until obviously closing for the current works.
Interestingly as well, when we started the project, when we started looking at the design and the first ideas of the project, we got in touch with the guy who designed this in the 1980s, who's a guy called Tom Lonsdale, he's still practicing now, and we walked around the square, and some fascinating insights into why he designed it in that way. A lot of people, I think, probably still believe that that was the historic square because it had that sort of almost heritage Victoriana kind of like look to it. And his advice to us was, you are going to struggle to convince people that taking the other part of the road out of the project, out of the square, that's going to be a really difficult thing to ask, and you're going to find some real challenges doing that. But I think we'll see where we go with that. But that was a definite wise words from the previous designer.
And so this was the square, not long after completion in 1987, and I think you can see there that sense that people are now, kind of moving across the space freely. But there was still, the road at that point was still kind of wrapped around the other sides of the square, which we'll come on to. And I suppose in the period, kind of 30 years from the 80s scheme to 2017, a lot of things happened that I think the space almost became a victim of its own success in terms of the amount of, the popularity, the things like the Christmas markets and the events that started to kind of dominate the space. So, I think, Kev, you're going to come on to that.
Yeah. So this is the next image in the sequence of Vallette. So Emily Allchurch, 2015. And we've loved this image. This was around when we started. It's that kind of like the next sort of step up. But you can see there, it's still got the roads there. Where you have a black cab there. On the previous image, you have a horse and cart, and you've got your dustman there. And the previous image is a guy with a dust cart. So it's really interesting. This image. So. And this is how we found it. This is the kind of 2017 aerial photograph that was taken. You can see at this point, it's really looking dilapidated, and you would know just by walking through it that. And we got some images in a bit. Just the condition of the surfaces on the square. You can see that just by that sort of coloured blob in the middle, which is I don't even know what that was at the time, but. You can see all that scarring on the surface. That's all tarmac that's replaced the cobbles, and that was put in to make the tram work. And there's a new gas lines and new services that come in there. We'll show you a plan in a minute of the services that are in the square, and you won't believe it really. So at this point, it's become really dilapidated, a victim of its own kind of popularity as an event space. It was never really designed to take, 40-ton vehicles with Christmas markets on them and moving around and pulling on those sets and things. So that sort of engineering that happens underneath the surface just isn't up to scratch. So that's a thing that we've dealt with in the next sort of the next kind of designs. You can see there very clearly how that sort of, again, that dominance of the road going through it. And, this is the pride and joy in the city, and this is quite often how you would find it for a couple of months of the year. Massive vehicular dominance, particularly at sort of peak hours. This is arriving up at the top of Lloyd Street. Coming into that corner as a pedestrian, it's like you're met with this kind of wall of cars. If there's any kind of event space on, which very often there was at Albert Square. That kind of takes away that enjoyment of actually where is the entrance to the town hall is very, very clear. It's very unclear where you're supposed to go at this point. So you generally, when there's something going on in the square, people are moving around it and heading somewhere else. That's another image at the top of Brasenose Street. I don't know who remembers this concrete monstrosity that turned up one day that hugged the end of the edge of the square. This was a security barrier that kind of wrapped around. But again, lots of kind of street clutter as you arrive there, and again the dominance of the vehicles. That's probably more of an obvious image. There's concrete barrier which they're put there to protect people using the space. I think this image is taken just set up at the Christmas market, but one thing that stands out to us at this point is people are walking in the road to go around it. They're not using the square, they're walking in the road. So again, it's that kind of popularity of the Christmas markets, just and there again, this is a really strong picture. We think the markets just grew and grew and grew to the point where they couldn't grow anymore, and they were basically pushing pedestrians out. Again, that sort of victim of its own success, people having to step on the pavement to get round it. When we started the project, this was really interesting, wasn't it? We put some cameras, we put some stop motion cameras on the clock tower, looking down on the square. Really, I think to show how the square functioned really on a how you would build a Christmas market, what were the sequencing, how people were sort of using the space, moving through it. And we put them up there for about 3-4 months, didn't we? And then kind of we were researching all the time the information that was kind of coming back, and that's just on traffic flow, setup of events, particularly the Christmas market, and the sort of Christmas light. Do you remember that? The Christmas light switch on was really interesting because it showed a very slow gathering of people coming into the square, very, very slowly gathering, and then filling the square up. And then the lights go on, and then everybody empties in 10 minutes. It's gone. It's absolutely gone. And that made us sort of think about, well, what if what if there's an incident in the square where you need to get people out? At that point, people were kind of like, where do we go? Where do we go? So they're the things that sort of help you influence how you're designing a new space, is how you get people in comfortably, how you get people out comfortably. Another thing to mention on this is when the Christmas markets were on, in the previous square, we've got them right the way up to the town hall edge of the moat. You can see them there. They're using every inch of the square. So circulation, you just can't circulate around that square with a market. You're having to go right away around the edges. And we felt that was a bit of a sad story. So we've kind of we've done a work around that. Again, this is shows some of the condition of the square as it was when we started to design it. Again, you can see all that sort of scarring. One of the big things came out of this was the extensive engagement we had with the accessibility groups. We did an age-friendly audit. We were still talking with the accessibility groups 4 years in. So constantly having workshops with them on the detail design and all that kind of stuff. But you can see there, the trees are lifting out the sets. It's very uneven. It's not a good surface to be kind of moving around.
One of the cobbles.
Because we scared to pass them. We do have a couple of samples here. Yeah. I'm scared to pass them around in case some of them breaks their toes with them.
Yeah.
But by all means, come up after we've.
So to say, when we started as well, you go into the square and the sets were actually loose, so people kind of picking them up. I think a lot of people kind of quite nicely dropping them down into the moat, as if that was a kind of moat place for kind of reclaimed sets.
So again, that sort of building accessibility. A big part of our brief was to make the town hall accessible. So if you are a wheelchair user, before the designs start to evolve, so you ain't going through that entrance. You're going around the side entrance, the serviceman's entrance, up the Lloyd Street ramp, and then coming back round. So it's a very sort of mismatch approach. If you're on foot, you can get through the steps. So big part of the brief was to make the square or the building accessible from the square, and also obviously the whole of the town hall has now become accessible. So we looked at, with the architect at the town hall, we looked at several different options. We looked at raising the entire level of the square gradually up, so that you would walk in flat to the doorway that you can kind of see there, and that had too much of an impact on the moat. We looked at punching through some of the building parts. That wasn't seen appropriate. So that was a real challenge, and we'll show you how we kind of resolved that when Matt gets on to design. And this is what we find under the square. This sort of spaghetti of uncharted services, some charted, some recorded, many not. And we've got Joe here from Manchester City Council, head of tree officer. He knows all about this because it's always been probably a challenge throughout your entire working life, I imagine, trying to plant trees in the city centre. So this is what we find, an absolute spaghetti of services. And when you're trying to sort of, think about new trees and all that kind of thing, and make changes and change levels around as well, has a massive impact on these. As well as that, we've got the new district heating line that's come from next to Manchester Central, just opposite the Britain's Protection. You can see there's that sort of plant space. That's now giving district heating to the city, and the town hall project is plugged into that. You can see it. I can't point again, but you can see it coming in Mount Street on the left-hand side there. So again, we're having to work around all of these things, all of the designs, any new kind of things. All right.
Yeah. So I think, as Kev's just gone through all those challenges and issues that we kind of came across at the start of the project. So we started to look at those kind of public realm strategies and really kind of high-level thinking in terms of what we could do with the square. And I think, those two images really sort of tell the picture. It's kind of, that initial image, that historic setting when the square was completely open and it was a proper setting to the building. And I think, 140 years later, we're tasked with recreating that setting for the building. And, kind of the first thing we looked at is what can we do with the road, because we found that was such a sort of barrier to that connectivity. And obviously the 1987 scheme, took away one of those routes. But when we first started, it was not a given that we could remove the road. So we kind of started to look at different options. Option one being, kind of we retain the road, but we maybe start to look at materiality, try to kind of, narrow some of those routes, because it was a really sort of vast sea of tarmac out there. Option two was, can we, kind of keep a loop to the southern edge, which is the north or the top as we're looking at it, to confuse things. But yeah, and
just creating keeping a link between Mount Street and Lloyd Street.
Lloyd Street and Southmont Street, in the top corner.
Yeah.
And then the final option was, can we completely remove the roads that run through the square? On all the options, it was never really something that we could consider taking out I don't think it would have gone down too well removing the newly installed second city crossing down Princess Street. So that's kind of retained, and that was always a constraint that we kind of worked around. But I think one of the things that was really powerful was when we looked at the actual area that you could kind of get back. I think on the bottom diagram, you can sort of see that red sort of shape is the roads cutting through the space. And it was around a quarter of the space was taken up by roads. But not only the kind of space was taken up, but that kind of disconnection that it created between all of the buildings to the perimeter. So although the town hall, kind of sat on this public square, everything else was very disconnected. And the kind of preferred option 3, would give you 94% of that space was, kind of pedestrian public realm space, and only 6%, which was the Princess Street carriageway, would stay as being a kind of road. The other thing that kind of really, sort of worked together with that strategy was looking at the security. And obviously the images we looked at previously, we've had that concrete barrier all the way around the square. And so we looked at, well, if you protect the square, which is the diagram in the top left, you have a whole area where the space is not protected. And do we then need to look at kind of protecting those footways around the edges? So you end up with this kind of double row of kind of, bollards or some kind of protection measures, which really just didn't seem like it was, kind of both from a cost perspective, from a public realm and connectivity perspective, just wasn't a kind of idea we wanted to kind of look at. So the bottom image again was looking at, do you have that route to the south and the route to the north? And at least you can have this central space and you connect through to Brasenose Street. So you've got this kind of processional connection down into Lincoln Square. But the kind of, the option we really wanted to kind of push, and that's the main image on there, was you actually close the road and push the secure line out as far as we could and use the buildings as part of that secure line. So I can't point, but you can kind of see that those red squares and the dots are where we wanted to move that secure line to. And even taking it down onto the bottom of the image there is into St. Peter's Square, where there is already, an existing secure line. But we created that full, that kind of yellow zone is all fully protected, and just means that, you've got this environment which has no vehicles moving through other than events vehicles and, kind of service vehicles and things that need to get access onto the square. So looking at the events, again, that kind of strategy, the roads, the security and the events kind of all started to make sense. We can close the roads, we can push the secure line out. That gives us this, huge space in the centre of the square. And looking at the Christmas markets, that middle diagram, it's 4,400 square metres taken up by Christmas market, and you couldn't get to the front door. As Kev said, and you kind of, the markets were on, people had to walk around the road and couldn't even get to the front door. So if you weren't going to Christmas markets, your experience of the square was just as a kind of a very, kind of narrow footpath, and just as a kind of circulation route, really. The top right is the International Festival setup, which takes, a lot less space. But we found that even, kind of the smaller events, they dominated the central space. And in the bottom left, you can see that, kind of for 2/3 of the year, there was either an event on the space or an event was being kind of built or broken down, which meant that, it's only 1/3 of the year people could actually use the space freely, which seemed like, kind of a really, kind of the wrong thing for Manchester's most important civic space. And again, you know, kind of what that does for the experience of the building as well, and people being able to kind of see the building in a proper setting. So this was the preferred approach. The image in the top left is the Christmas markets. You could accommodate the full Christmas market and still have the 7-metre route along the front of the building and generous footways all around the edge. And also the kind of the sort of amber colour around the edges is a sort of zone that we could still have, so people could sit around the edge of the markets and still dwell in the space rather than just having to kind of move around. The other major benefit is that, you know, the businesses around those edges still had space to spill out even during the Christmas markets as well. So, you know, just the opportunity for people to be able to still use a space even when those big events are taking place. And the main diagram shows that, you know, for a lot of the events, we found you could fit them into one half of the square and still have that green space, or a full kind of half of the square open to the public, and maintain that processional route, you know, from the entrance down onto Brasenose Street and Lincoln Square and beyond. And then I'm going to pass over to Joe, who could probably talk through this better. But, you know, the existing trees, though, was when we first started looking at the trees in the square, we had a tree survey. You know, some of the stuff that we found, I mean, the big thing, I suppose, was that we did the intrusive surveys, and we established that there were no roots within the top. I think it was 400 mil that were bigger than 2 mil. I think, you know. I'm going to step aside.
I couldn't reasons. So sorry, but I'm going to keep it down to 5 minutes. There was. Does anybody know John Kelsey from planning, senior planning officer? When the Metro link was going in, so this is going back quite a while, on the corner of Albert Square, the Metrolink engineers had done the plans, and then, as tends to happen on big projects, we'd made a mistake, we're going to have to cut down the trees on the corner. So somebody had previously said to me, you need to be really careful with these big projects, Joe, because this is not your world. You don't know how it works, and they'll just, you live in, the tree world is a gentleman's world, and everybody helps each other. This is not like that. So I'm going to have to recruit somebody. So I got John Kelsey from planning, senior planning officer. And we met the engineers from Metrolink, and I'll never, ever forget this. That John Kelsey said to the senior engineer from Metrolink, I know how engineers work. They do everything by the slide rule. So either you've lied to us or you're incompetent. Which one is it? And I just couldn't believe he'd said it. And the guy just because he knew John was right. So John Kelsey said to him, there is no way we're going to remove these trees. You are going to have to stick to your original plan. And the guy did. So they were lying to us. So moving further on the corner, they had to put in a great big support for the poles for the overhead wires. And in arboriculture, there's a thing called an air pick, which is sort of a very powerful jet, which can remove the soil, pulverise it without damaging the roots, and use a big vacuum mic, which is like a massive big vacuum cleaner to suck it all out. So they'd done this, they'd gone down at least 3 metres, which is 9 feet in all money. So myself and Noel Nugent, if anybody knows him, who took over from me, the tree officer for the council, we went out to see this. The ARB guys who dug the hole, who were used to doing it, there was the engineers were there. There was about 10 of us looking into this hole. There was nothing at all that looked like soil, nothing that even remotely resembled soil. It was sort of red stuff, tiny, no structure. None of us, there were engineers, there was arborists, none of us could even say what this stuff was. No structure to it, and there were no. These were the big plane. Sorry, these were the big plane trees. There was down to 3 metres. There was nothing that even resembled a decent sized room. We just couldn't believe it. And this might be just me making it up, but the only thing I thought was the original soil. You think we've had 2,000 years since the Romans were here. Who knows what's happened on this area? the only thing I could think was the roots had gone straight down, and eventually, microscopic bit by bit by bit, and eventually found the original soil layer, which is still down there, and it's tapped into that and spread. And just sorry to hog your meeting, but
Go on.
again, in the prelims to this, if anybody remembers the original underground toilets, they are still there, and I knew that. And I said to the guys who were doing the engineering, you'll find them, Dave, you get the plans, you'll find them down there. And they were filled in with pulverised fly ash from power stations. So when they dug it out, they called me and said, you were right. So the underground toilets are still there, and then they were full of this grey ash. So the roots have got an job in that square.
I mean, the other thing that you'll probably remember was the 80s scheme when we were talking about it. We were looking at those trees that were planted around the perimeter of that square that was created, kind of still, the image on the left there, you can see where the road is. The trees were kind of formed a kind of ring around the square. But we think they were planted in concrete manhole rings.
Yeah.
And that was the sort of typical practice at the time, was to kind of drop a manhole ring in, which was probably only, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 meters, kind of diameter.
And again, that's city. Is there anybody from city engineers? And not gonna.
You're not coming up as well, by the way. Forget it.
That was a classic one for city engineers, where they'd use these great big concrete sewerage rings and plant the trees in them on the grounds that the roots would never be able to grow out.
Of course, what they do is they go up, don't they? They're like a muffin in an oven. They pop out the top and they burst the pavements and it becomes.
And of course, the roots just use up all the nutrients. It's like being in a big plant pot, so they've got a very, very low. So those trees planted around the outside would have had a very, very limited. And again, I'll just say one last thing about a lot of the original trees. This was one of the very first things I did when I moved to Manchester. A lot of the original trees had actually been killed by leaking gas mains. Because again, the people who are old enough will remember, before we had natural gas, we had coal gas. And when the pipes leaked, it wasn't so much that they poisoned the roots, but they displaced the oxygen in the soil. So it was a terrible job. It was almost impossible for us to do. It wasn't just felling the trees. We had to get the roots out. And normally you'd strap a big winch on and pull them out, but there's nothing in the square. We thought, should we tie it onto a lamppost? Probably not a good idea. So it was a terrible job digging these massive great roots out. But all the roots were blue and purplish. And Vince Howard, who was the tree officer before me, who obviously remembered the old type of gas, said, yeah, that's a classic one. We used to get that an awful lot. So it's, yeah. And I would talk about the greenhouse effect and the city centre East Island effect, which I love. We should play with it. We should.
Yeah. Yeah, appreciate it. But I think going back to, those issues that we had, and, it's always a massive kind of sort of debate around, removing trees. But we felt that for several reasons, one of them being that we're creating this new square and those trees sat kind of within, what was going to be that new open space. But we, as we just talked about then, the fact that those trees, when we looked at the condition that they were in, and they weren't thriving, and they were kind of planted these concrete manhole rings, we looked at how long, what was the sort of lifespan of the trees that had been planted in the 80s. So we made the decision to remove the majority of the category B trees. I think all the category B trees. So trees have different categories that kind of when they're assessed. And the trees that were the most significant trees were the ones that were planted in the 1950s, and they were kind of row of London planes. And so we looked at retaining 4 of the London planes, so 2 that sit kind of right in the middle of the space, and 2 that sit to the north of the space. And they were the category was high because of their significance within the space. Not because I think if they were in any other location, they probably wouldn't have been such a high category, but because of the space they were in and what they gave back to that space, that was why they were kind of categorized in that way. And so we felt it was important to retain those trees, but then as part of the new strategy, push those trees out to the edges so you kind of create, this perimeter of green around the square, but you open up the space so you can have all those events and all those activities we talked about. And then I think, kind of it's quite simple really, this diagram. Don't know if it kind of how kind of clearly you can see, but essentially because we're able to completely kind of, open up that space, the kind of access and movement was a very simple thing. You kind of come into the corner of the square, those images where you looked at previously, people kind of walking through the road, and we had kind of, very narrow footways with sort of metal guardrails and things. Actually, the strategy was that you can then come and arrive in each of those sort of 5 arrival spaces as you come into the square, and have clear sight lines. So, create this really clear sort of sight lines and desire lines around the perimeter. And that big central open space, again, you can see the front door, you can see all of those spaces. And so that was a big part of the access. And then the other one, which we touched on earlier, was making sure that, from the square, the main entrances on Albert Square and Cooper Street on St. Peter's Square were fully accessible. So you can walk into the front door, kind of as a fully accessible sort of entrance to the building, which I think prior to that, as Kev said, you had to go round the sort of side entrance, which, in this day and age was kind of totally wrong. But, people had different forms of access to Manchester's, kind of most important public building. I won't kind of go through everything on here, but this was, we spent 2 years, probably, when we first started on the project, just talking to people, consulting with, different stakeholder groups. You can see, accessibility is the biggest one, takes up almost the whole column on there. We kind of talked to, I think, 7 external access groups. Also, we had an internal access panel, did a whole load of work on security, the utility, statutory undertakers, heritage. We talked with the Victorian Society, which I think we'll kind of come on to a little bit of that later, and the conservation panel as well. And a whole load of people, just did a whole load of talking and research and sort of discussing all sorts of different elements of the project before we even started really designing. And
it's interesting though on that. We'll leave it on that. I suppose, but not all of those groups that we talk to agree with each other. So you've got different stakeholders that have different needs and have different sort of directions they want to take the square. So you have, I think, one of the biggest sort of conflicts we had, which we hope we've resolved, is the accessibility groups and cyclists, and particularly people with visual impairments moving through the space, and the conflicts that you find with cyclists. And I think where we kind of landed was actually you can't please everyone, but there's a measured solution. So there's a balanced solution that can work for everyone. So I think what we end up with now is a space that is accessible to things like cyclists, but is on a very sort of kind of share with care kind of basis. Go on, Matt.
Oh, this image. So this was a quickly mocked up image of the I suppose an update to the Emily Old Church after the Villette image, and I suppose we're going to come onto the design in the next section. But I think this was just, I suppose, captures all of those aspects that we wanted to kind of create. So the idea that people were connected with the space, so all those businesses around the edge could now sit on the edge of the square. Events, opportunity in the middle, a fully accessible space, and that kind of perimeter greening as well. I think we're going to come on to sort of more of the detail now.
Okay, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to start speeding through this. So these were some of the sort of key principles that came out of the brief that we were following. So we set up I think 8 principles that would lead us through the design of this, things that were really important. Objectives for the project. The first one there on the left-hand side, you can see there, is creating this destination and this external enhanced setting for the town hall and a real sort of place of beauty in the civic quarter. The next one was the creation of this really sort of high quality public space, civic space that connected all of those spaces around it together. And then the third one was really thinking hard about sort of protecting these heritage assets around the square. We did a lot of work at the time on the monuments. We asked a lot of questions about, are the monuments still relevant to today's society? There's a whole sort of debate going on over the last few years. And I think the answer was, very clearly, yes, they need to stay in the square. We talked about, do we move them to different parts of the square, didn't we? If you remember that. And I think it was very much the sort of resounding feedback through the engagement was those monuments should really stay where they are because they tell a story of, how the square formed. And Matt's kind of picked up on that as, through the earlier part of this discussion. But protecting those kind of really sort of key views of the square, those key heritage assets were really, really important. Again, Matt's just talked around their access and how you move around it. Security, we picked up on earlier, how you protect the square, in the event of when there's an event on or, just generally kind of day to day, and improve the function and operation of the square. You talked a little bit about, the time it takes to take down a market or an event and set up it was huge. We were really kind of surprised by it. And a lot of that was to do with, how it was powered. So setting up power coming out of the town hall moat and actually having all these sort of power cables around and just to make it sort of function didn't make sense to us. So you'll see now there's kind of, there's power and water supply at different points around the square. So when people are doing an event, they're in, and it's a lot quicker for them to set up an event, and then they come down, and then they're taken down a lot quicker as well. The kind of active travel principle and actually being able to encourage walking and cycling and connectivity to the tram was really, really, most of the, the time, the B network, principles were really sort of gathering out of steam, and we kind of followed a lot of that. That follows through in the, the wayfinding and a lot of the sort of strategies that we've followed through with. And then, I'm not inviting Joe to come back up on, but actually greening of the space and getting some more, looking at opportunities to actually get some sort of some gardens back into into the square, or not back into them, but to introduce some. And we love this image, and actually it could go off the page a bit more. What that gives you is you've got St. Peter's Square at the bottom of the page. The new design that you can see in the middle of the page there is the Albert Square design. I'll blow up in a second. All of those kind of yellow coloured in zones are now uninterrupted pedestrian public realm that you can walk through the city uninterrupted by roads. So you can start from what is now kind of Wagamama's on the other side of St. Peter's Square. You can walk all the way through Albert Square down through Lincoln Square and down to Deansgate. That's a 0.5 kilometre route through the city. That's pretty impressive, we think. And it just takes a little bit of thinking from an urban design connectivity kind of point of view. And there's, we're now talking around, what we do to Deansgate and sort of bringing the traffic down on Deansgate, and then you're into Spinningfield, and then you're into New Bailey. You add those things up and you've got this route from St. Peter's Square down to the river, which is almost a kilometre of uninterrupted. I mean, it's amazing, right? So, that's something really we think is really worth celebrating. So when we start looking at the square and this kind of layout as we're kind of evolving the master plan, if you like, we look at how the space breaks down. I talked a little bit on the right-hand side about, introducing that sort of green space as kind of like these more intimate sort of seating edges, but also a green buffer, maybe to the tram on Princess Street on the right-hand side there. You've got these really strong arrival points into the square where you kind of stop and take a breath because you now see the town hall in all its glory. You've got fantastic circulation around the edges of the building. And then you've got enough dwell space around the edges of the square. So Matt will get on to some of the detailed design on the benches that we're introducing. Really huge, benches. If you combine that circulation with dwell, and you start to think about how the occupiers and the restaurants and the bars around the square can use those spaces, all of a sudden you've got this really, it feels really sort of continental kind of space you'd see in Barcelona. It's complete breakout where you've got this really sort of busy edges, and then you've got this, pure square in the middle. So that's the kind of formation of the character of the plan, and then that's the plan. So this is your new Albert Square, or as it will be when it's delivered in the next few months. You can see there the strong line of trees across the top row, with benches that sit through the middle. You can clearly see the circulation around the edges with that sort of lighter colour tone, and you can clearly see the sort of middle bit. So we go from those lighter edges being, York stone flags, and then the sort of middle of the square is much more sort of smaller scale granite sets that sit within it with different colour tones. So it has a very sort of defined kind of central space, and then you can just see that sort of diamond pattern that cuts through that we talked long and hard about, and debated with the conservation panels, Heritage England, Victorian Society, how you could do something in the paving that could connect up all of the monuments and make them feel as kind of one purposeful kind of thing. So, and then further down the page, you can see kind of against the front of the town hall, that's how we've made it accessible. So we've moved the steps that currently sit on the front of the town hall, and we've moved them out. Those steps will still be there, but we'll build over the top of them. So you're creating this kind of like, and basically, you then sort of, you've got this shallow gradient that's coming up from the right-hand side. It means that it's very low impact on the moat. It's very low impact on the building itself. And we feel, well, we think it's appropriate. We talked to the architect, who's the head architect on the town hall project, and he thinks it's an appropriate solution to that style of building of the time. So that creates this kind of like kind of elegant wing with a very sort of wide step on the front, so you can get immediately from the sides into the town hall, and then sort of step up right to the entrance as you kind of do now. You can see the existing trees that we've got in the main square there. They're the sort of bigger trees, the bigger dark colour trees. They're the ones that are being retained, with the new trees all around the edges. You can clearly see the bollards at the entrances in to the square. And then on the left-hand side, you can see Mount Street, and how that now sort of flows in without interrupting the square. That route will be for services and access to the town hall only, and for setting up of vehicles. So that's, and then again the sort of gardens that we see on the right hand side as well. So that's your new plan for your new town square. That's what it was. So we just wanted to come back to this. This is that plan with the existing road layout over the top of it, and it shows the opportunity and the impact that the road had on the square, and what the opportunity has been to take it out. And we did a heritage impact assessment. I don't think I've ever done an impact assessment of public realm on a building. It's usually you're doing buildings on landscape and visual impact on landscapes, but there was a heritage impact assessment that was done at the time of at the time of planning, and we just wanted to drop a couple of images out of there for that. That's the top row is that clear view coming in from South Mill Street as it used to be, and then the dominance of the road in the middle, and clearly hard to really sort of get a measure on where the town hall is, and then that's a visualization of where it will be at the end of the project. So you arrive, the road's gone, you've got this really sort of clear view in front of you, and open space, celebrates town hall. And then this one on the bottom row is from Brasenose Street. Again, we tried to camera match these up the best we can, but you can see, arriving at the top of Brasenose Street, you've got this sort of clear route that allows you to move through. Probably, I think that sort of celebration of the Albert Memorial as well is something that we really focused on. And then that's a bigger view coming in, arriving that view. So just a real, I think, real transformation of the space. Very clear to see the monuments there. And then that's the aerial one. Some of these you might have seen in the MEN and different kind of press releases, but that gives you that perception of this as a truly kind of pedestrianised space that is made by the buildings that surround it, influenced by the buildings that surround it, not by the infrastructure that run through it. And then this is a view that's coming through from Princess Street when you come around the corner of the town hall. You can see on the left-hand side there, that sort of quite slow gradient leading up to what is the town hall entrance at that point. And then these kind of gardens that sort of sit on that edge of the square next to Princess Street. And then I'm going to hand over to you. I think Matt, you're going to talk quite a lot about the detail there.
So I'll pick up on some of the detail and the different elements of the design, which we've kind of talked through. I think Kev's touched on the material concept, but what was, I think, a sort of challenge for us was we wanted to create this, really vast space, but how do you then not make it feel very, I suppose bringing a level of detail into that, and how do you kind of break down the space a little bit? And so we kind of came up with this idea, picking up on those strong geometries that are created by the town hall building, at Lloyd Street and Princess Street kind of angles, and also that kind of movement, the way people naturally move across the square, led to this idea of the sort of diamond kind of bands as a sort of, visual stitching, a way of kind of bringing together the space, and also the monuments that were not kind of perfectly aligned with the building edge. And also something from a constructability point of view as well, you have these kind of natural break points. In terms of material, again, we've talked about, I think, the sort of sets to the central area, which were a smaller format and reference back to that historic setting. And we did a lot of work looking at, historic images and talking to different conservation groups. And it was really kind of important that we put something in that felt, kind of a small scale set, but that was fully accessible. So that's where the kind of design kind of went to. And also in terms of the material choices, which we'll kind of come on to, did a whole load of work. That image in the top left was in the town hall, in the sample room, which was, very, very tidy, as you can see, had it all carefully organized. But, it was, we did a lot of work looking at material and working with, all the different stakeholders and sort of discussing kind of colour palette. And I think what we wanted to do was use the reference of the York stone material that is used throughout Manchester, but is kind of quite a soft material. And we felt that we wanted to use granite, which was harder and more robust within those central areas, the event space. But we wanted the palette to feel complementary. So we've got that kind of buff grey tones that run throughout. And the other element which, we took from the St. Peter's Square inspiration was this small kind of green kind of detail which is incorporated into the paving. And we found when we were doing the initial kind of work and discussing with the architect Purcell that the roof of the town hall used this material, this green slate, and it was the same material that that Waterhouse had used on the original roof. So there's a really nice relationship between, the building, the buff stone of the building, the green roofs, and so it's kind of reflected out in the public realm, but in a way that we think is quite subtle and doesn't take away from the, the building itself. I think I need to rush along a little bit. Blame Joe.
Go back one. I think there is an important slide there. What have we done with the material that's come out of Albert Square?
Yeah.
So that's not gone to waste. There's an image there. So we've used it on the access roads going around the square. A lot of the York stone will find its way into the moat to resurface the moat. A lot of those sets have found their way into projects all around Manchester, but the bottom corner is Ancoats Green. So there's a new park being built at Ancoats Green, and a lot of the material that's coming out of the Albert Square project is finding its way into that project. So it's staying in the city. It's not being ending up under a road base or ending up in landfill or anything like that. Material that is being recycled and used appropriately.
So Kev's already touched on the entrances. This is just a little bit of detail around that. And as he said, what we wanted to do was bring the steps out so that you create this access that brings you up to that landing level so you can walk through the front door at grade, and it's a fully accessible entrance. We've done the same thing at Cooper Street as well. And this is an image which, again, there's just some of the little details, like the way I'll move back one, you can sort of see the way the plinths splay. They reference the splay of the entrance as well. So we wanted to really create a relationship between what we were, kind of installing in the square and the building. It's such a kind of prominent entrance, and we needed to kind of really sort of do it justice in terms of that, respectful relationship between the new and the old. So that's an image that I suppose captures, kind of the proposals and just some of the detail. I'll try and go through some of these slides a little bit more quickly, but again, kind of looking at some of the details, the handrail, we've done, so much work on this, both in terms of access, but also looking at that kind of heritage, and the handrail design was referencing the original handrails within the building, but doing something that was slightly more contemporary in terms of material, looking at using timber, so it's kind of warm to touch. So lots of different considerations have gone into these, and then we've, detailed design, modelling, and the images on the right are the samples of both the handrails, and also this is the stone that we're using in the square. So you can see the block in the bottom right, that's the piece of stone that our blocks are coming out of, and they are really, monumental in scale, these pieces of stone. The seating, as we've talked about, we wanted to create this sort of dwell space in between the circulation routes and the central square is where you have all of the tree planting, all those kind of features that don't kind of clutter the space, but provide that, kind of opportunity to actually sit in the space and look back at the building. And I think, it was really important that these were of scale that, kind of was right for the space. And we took, again, kind of, outside here, you can see the St. Peter's Square, which was delivered just before we started on the scheme. They have these really, kind of monumental seats that people can kind of gather around. And we felt that was a really, kind of important thing, that there's lots of different seating throughout the space. And there's also sort of different seating types as well. So you have, seats with backrests, with shorter depths, with armrests, different seating heights as well. So there's a lot of consideration has gone into the sort of amount of seating and the detail of the seating throughout the space. Again, I think we've probably talked enough about trees and green space, but I'll kind of quickly, talk about the kind of concept, which is to bring some of the kind of character of the trees from St. Peter's Square through, which is the kind of three trees on the left-hand side of the image. And on the right-hand side, the kind of blue new trees, more of a kind of mix of planting in the garden spaces. So this kind of, Joe loves, trying to get as many new trees and new species into the city as possible. And I think we've kind of really tried to do that and actually, have lots of different kind of seasonal interest. But then the kind of formal avenue, so that kind of yellow avenue of trees along the western edge of the square, our tulip trees, we wanted something that was really, kind of, we have seen in the city before, but they're a really kind of, great sort of avenue tree. They grow really, really well, and also have a kind of climate resilience as well. We think, they're a North American native tree, but they're kind of used a lot in the UK, and we think kind of with warmer temperatures, they're a good city tree. And then just the sort of detail. We didn't think we'd use the heritage concrete ring detail. We've gone with a 5 by 5 meter tree pit, so 25 meter cube, and just going back to the those services diagrams that you saw, the kind of challenge of trying to get a row of trees to work in the kind of spaghetti of services has been one of the most challenging things. So I think something that looks very simple on plan, and when you go out into the street and you see the kind of very simple line of trees and furniture, the challenge in making that happen has been a massive piece of work. We've done some diversions, but we're trying to kind of work around existing utilities. And then we've already sort of seen the footage of the trees going in, but it was, I think, one of the most exciting things to sort of see those trees kind of land in the square, and the sort of transformation that you see. This summer's been the first season they've been installed and have kind of come into leaf. And there are more trees that have been planted this season, so kind of I think even as we speak, there's sort of more trees that are going to be going in on that Princess Street edge. And then just the nighttime, there's a whole kind of whole sort of other aspect for the square is that nighttime kind of experience. And we work with Arab lighting, the lighting designers to kind of look at how we could light the space. And one of the key things was to create that complete open space. So we looked at moving all of the lighting to the perimeter and having these really sort of tall columns that project light into the central areas, but also allowed, a little bit of a drop off so that we could then highlight the monuments in the centre. And then we have, kind of obviously sort of important to light the entrance spaces and those arrival spaces. So this was the lighting column design. The image on the right, you can see they've already been installed out in the square. And they, again, the kind of scale of these is kind of quite epic. They were kind of 14-metre tall columns with these cluster of luminaires along the top. Another aspect that we've incorporated was we wanted to have something that's quite playful and that we could use to sort of animate the space. So we've got these projectors which are on the columns to the corners of the space that will be able to project different lighting effects into the square. Got kind of the cheesy bee, but they're sort of can be changed and adapted. And I think again it just adds another dimension. And there's a whole other lighting scheme for the building itself. So it's kind of looking at how you can sort of enjoy the square and the building together.
That's another lecture.
That's a whole separate lecture. I think again, I think we've talked a lot about this, but it's just quite interesting to sort of show all of the different investigation that we did before we actually started any works on the square. And you kind of see, almost every time you put a kind of, digger, a spade in the ground, we came across services. And I think this is a great image that kind of captures, kind of just the sort of challenges that we had. Again, just a couple of details I wanted to talk about. So one was the sleeves to the bollards. We've kind of got these decorative sleeves, and the image on the right is the drainage channel. I think just wanted to capture that we didn't want to have too much ornament and decoration through the square, but there is these little kind of details and moments as you walk through the space that we've kind of referenced things from the building and those little motifs like the acanthus leaf, which we've picked up in the drainage channel. So there's a lot of consideration of all the kind of fine details that have gone into the space. Including this was lug this around on my bike today, but this was a kind of a bronze cotton flower, and the motif was taken from inside the building, which is that image in the top centre. And so we wanted to kind of put this detail back into the square. So we've got these bronze cotton flowers, which again, they're quite subtle within the space, but just those little kind of elements of detail that we feel it's really important, to kind of almost the way Waterhouse has, kind of had, beauty and detail throughout the building. We wanted to kind of put some of that back into the public realm. This was a competition that we did for bespoke manhole covers. And again, it was, something that was a little bit quirky, but we thought it was a great opportunity. Talked about the monuments, in the space, but an opportunity to tell some new stories and some new ideas and new artworks in there.
How many responses did we get to? It was a lot. We got dozens of designs coming back to us. Yeah, so we got over 100 designs coming back to us. So it was just a public competition, to Manchester, and we got some amazing ideas back. And this is very common in places, places we've been like Copenhagen and Spain and different sort of European cities. It actually becomes a really sort of decorative thing, and we thought that could be something really great. So we got these fantastic responses back, and we had a judging day, and these were 5 that won. I think there is another one, but and they were from a huge spectrum. We had a kids group who did one. We had historics, a very historic one. We had one that was very much one that talked about mental health, which was really, really powerful. But yeah, you'll see those start to sort of appear over the year.
And then, just Hey,
Let me talk.
are you going to talk about this? Yeah.
Yeah. Who's been in the courtyard? As many people been in the courtyards? I mean, they are absolutely phenomenal, and you can stand in there and you can take yourself back 100 years, and there's other than the weird kitchen link that ended up there, but there's very few things that give it away that it's changed in anything. So when we started looking at them at the courtyards, it became evident that sort of central space needed to accommodate an underground attenuation tank for drainage to take some of the water that was coming out of the roof. So we knew we had to dig down. There was massive problems with kind of subsidence in the courtyard. But it became very evident early on that the courtyard needed to be treated with the same rigor and respect as the building. And that meant that you deal with it as a grade 1 listed element of the building. So we spent a very, very long time, and you can see there that top right-hand image, those scores that are on those sandstone sets, they were put on by someone to make traction work better for the horses and carts that were coming in and out of the gate. So that's just to give them a little bit of traction. We had to protect that. So we spent a very long time cataloguing virtually every stone that is in that square, and you can see that the image on the left-hand side, the grey part of that on the top right-hand corner, is blown up on the next image on the right-hand side. So you can see that every row of sets there has been catalogued and taken away and packaged, and will go back in exactly the same order, even the direction of the kind of those sets with the traction. So it looks exactly the same as it did when it goes back. That was a lot of work. And then the last few slides, before and after, this is again just coming into the square at that point, and that's where we are now. So we're opening up the square bit by bit as we can make space and remove parts of the compound. Whenever we get a space, we build it bit by bit. So that's a massive transformation coming in from Mount Street. Again, the road there, that's looking back the other way. True pedestrian space. This is a really good one, we think. And that's what that is now. I'm going to go back one because it tells a good story. That's the transformation that we have now, and this is a great one. The right-hand side, that image there is tourists that are looking back on, I think that's St Andrew's Chambers, looking back on that building where they would be stood now, or back then would be in the middle of the road. So now they're sort of, they're back in the public realm. So past, back to the Valette, present, and Matt's image, future. Thank you very much.